everyone, and welcome to a new video. Today's video is going to be another weekly / project specific vlog sort of thing. I posted another one of these recently, which will be linked up above as well as in the description box down below. And I would really recommend that you watch that video first because this is kind of a continuation of it. I'm going to be working on one of the projects that was originally mentioned in that video. Just to give a little recap, in that original vlog, I was making two late 1830s dresses. One of them was made out of a red dotted fabric and had ruched details at the front and pretty roughly sleeves, and the other dress had gathering around the neckline and longer sleeves. It was made out of a mustard tone floral fabric. Now, I drafted these two dresses together and I fitted both of the bodices together, but I did not end up making really any progress on the floral dress in that video. I very much focused on the dotted dress and actually showed the process of making that from start to finish. But the floral dress kind of got left behind. So I decided I would film another video where it was the primary focus and you get to see some of the steps that I went through when making it. Now usually for my vlogs or more casual videos, I film the intro and then I film all the content you see after the video. So it's filmed in order. But that's not what's happening today, because I lost the intro that I originally filmed for this video, along with several other clips that were supposed to be in it, and to explain the early stages of the bodice progress. A lot of those clips got mixed in with the video that focused on the red dress vlog, and I forgot to move those files to this folder before I deleted all the clips for that video after I finished editing it. So unfortunately, I just don't have access to those clips and I can't share them with you today. But I do have one clip which kind of explains some stuff, so I'm going to go ahead and roll that right now. So it is the next day, and I am briefly back to work. I've been working on a whole bunch of things today. Not only this dress, but also a project for McCall's, and a few pieces for a series that I have coming up, and just some general stuff. But it's the evening now, and I thought I'd take an hour or two to focus on this, since I'm really eager to progress on it. So what I've gone ahead and done is folded the top edge for these wrapped pieces inward by a 1/2 inch, and then I stitched that down by machine, and then I stitched them together by machine, making sure that the center front points were even. Then I top stitched on, once again by machine, the gathered portion that I created earlier in the week. So I haven't finalized the gathering at the top edge, but the bottom edge was gathered down to fit these panels, and then I once again lined up the center point so I knew it would be all nice and even. Then I went ahead and made up a whole bunch of piping. Now for the dress I'm basing this off of, they used piping in the same color as the main dress material. So the piping should be made out of this fabric, not something contrasting. But if you saw the last video, then you'll know I just finished a dress that had matching piping. And even though I like how it looks, and it's very typically 1930s and 40s to have this, I can't help but feel like some of the detail work gets lost since it blends in with the main color of the dress. So for this one, I thought I would switch it up a little bit and use some contrasting piping. So I'm using this really great burgundy colored silk shantung, which I actually purchased for a 1950s Sewing Through the Decades project, which will be coming up soonish, at least for patrons it will be. It's one of the bonus projects that the $10 tier of people got to pick out. So I'm really excited to get started on that, but I thought I'd use a little bit of the fabric for this dress since it really brings out the color in the flowers. So now I'm going to take that and use it to outline this 2-inch strip of the floral fabric, which I turned the edges inward so they touched. So I now have an even 1-inch wide quite long strip. And now you should be all nice and caught up. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this on and pin the piping on, and then I can hand sew it all together later tonight. I'm back! So the reason I'm back is because there's even more to explain. You see that last clip, which is the only clip you've seen thus far, was filmed about a month ago before I took 3 weeks away from this project. I had some more time-sensitive projects I need to focus on and get those finished up and shipped out, and I also ended up visiting family for about a week. So the rest of the footage in this video, which I will get to very soon, was filmed in a 5-day period after I got home. The reason I want to explain that is otherwise you're probably going to be confused over the fact that I was confused about the state of this project. Since it'd been a little while since I'd worked on it, I couldn't quite remember what state it was in and what steps I'd already taken towards completing it. So I just want to clear that up and also kind of give myself an excuse for not filming a whole lot about the bodice construction of this. However, I did take lots of pictures, so I'm going to have a blog post that goes through the kind of beginning stages of the bodice in a little bit more detail in case you're wondering how that all went together. So now I have to evaluate where I am in this project because it's been a while since I've worked on it, and then I will tell you how I'm going to move forward in this project once I get that all figured out. Okay, so it is a little bit later and I figured out where I was with this project. So I had the front panels stitched together and the top portion of it gathered, and I had the side portions gathered down, but I need to line the side portions to reinforce them because they were kind of gaping away at the center and making the waist appear bigger than it was. Since the center portion wasn't contained, it was just the bottom and top edges that were gathered. So I went ahead and lined those pieces, and I top stitched where the gathering ends just to keep it in position. And I think I'm going to have to end up doing it on this side too because the gathers just don't look very nice in the middle. They really puff out in a way that they don't on the example garment that I'm following. So that's kind of annoying, and that's something that I'm going to have to resolve later. But I was happy enough with this that I sewed up the side seams, and then I sewed some piping onto the top edge of the shoulder, and I also sewed some piping around the arm side. So now I have to turn this edge inward and whip stitch it to the lining, then I have to turn this edge inward and whip stitch it to the shoulder portion and repeat that process on the other side. But before doing that, I'm probably going to line the front just because it will be difficult to line this after the shoulder seam is done up. However, I've agreed to watch some stuff with my family, so I'm going to focus on sewing the piping at the arm side inward, and then I will come back and do the lining later tonight. So I sewed the piping on, and I stitched it down for the front with running stitches to make sure that I liked how it was positioned, and then I just whip stitched the raw edge to the lining. It doesn't look particularly pretty, but this is often how it looked on extant garments, so I'm not beating myself up about it too much. And it's going to get covered by the tops of the sleeves later on. I also turned the seam allowance for the side seams inward and whip stitched that down, and then I just sewed the lining for the front panel inward. So now this is all nice and pretty on the inside, which means I can do up the shoulder seam. So I've gone ahead and folded this edge inward by 1/2 inch, and I've already sewed the piping onto this edge, so now I just have to combine these together and use little slip stitches to secure them. Then I can move on to gathering and binding the neckline. So that is going to be the next step, and hopefully next time I show it to you, it will be on the dress form and looking a lot more like a bob. Okay, so it's a little bit later now, and I got the shoulder seam sewn up, and I just did a fitting, and it seems like it's going to fit relatively well, but I haven't tried basting in a zipper and doing a fitting that way yet. I've just fit the arm side and the shoulder. So I need to do a better fitting later on. But when I was doing my kind of sloppy fitting, I realized that the neckline was really uneven. And even when I adjusted it, it was still much lower here than it was anywhere else. I think you can probably tell, but it slopes down really far here, and then it goes up, and then it goes straight up again. And it was just not the neckline that I was really looking for, and no matter how I tried to arrange the gathers, I couldn't seem to fix it. It was just very uneven and low at that specific spot. So I think it's a problem with how I sewed it in along this edge, but at this point, it's not really fixable. So what I decided to do instead was whip stitch a piece of ribbon to create a new neckline, and I'm going to trim off the excess material about 1/2 inch away from this edge, and then that will be my new neckline, and it will be hopefully a lot more even. So I'm actually going to stitch this on using my sewing machine, and then I will do a fitting to make sure that I like how the neckline looks before trimming off the excess material. So hopefully this will fix the issue that I was having there. I really don't know how that happened. That's so annoying. So here is a crappy fitting without foundation garments, but you can see the clear difference between the original neckline and all of its weird asymmetric glory and the new neckline, which I think is pretty even. It's not perfect. It's a little bit more rounded here than it is here, so I'm going to keep that in mind when I'm cutting off the top, and I'll level it out that way, but it looks way, way better than this asymmetric madness. And the neckline's a little bit lower too, which is less accurate to the example I'm following, but gives me a little bit more breathing room. I'm also happy with how this lays over the torso, and it's going to look even nicer once I have a foundation on to smooth everything out underneath it. However, the one problem I have with this is the back. Can you see my little poofy poof here? So as I suspected, I'm going to have to do some tacking stitches to keep that secure. I'm going to wait to figure that out until after I have the sleeves done. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and trim this top edge and get the piping sewn on and get the bias binding that will go on top of the piping prepped so I can try and get that sewn on tonight. So I went ahead and trimmed off the excess above the line of ribbon that I showed you earlier, and then I sewed the piping down so it sat on top of that ribbon, and I trimmed the edge just a little bit more, and then I sewed some bias binding over top using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and it turned out surprisingly well. It looks pretty even and nice. I'm actually kind of impressed with myself. However, there is a little bit of stitching visible, which I'm planning on covering up with some hand stitching, and there's also a little bit of that shiny ribbon that I used, which is kind of visible underneath the piping since I used that ribbon as a guide for where the piping should go. I think I need to sew down both edges of the piping, which is kind of a pain, but shouldn't be a big deal. And I also have to sew down the other side of the bias binding, which will also be done by hand. Speaking of work by hand, I'm going to turn this back edge inward by 1 inch, and I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch away from the edge using embroidery floss to create a little channel for boning, which is going to support the hooks and eyes, which will close the back of this. And I'm probably going to turn the raw edge inward as well, so it just looks prettier overall. My embroidery floss drawer is kind of a mess right now, but I did manage to find one strand or spool, or what are these called? But I found a bundle of embroidery floss which matches pretty well, so I'm going to use that for the stitching for the boning channel, and probably for some of the stitching up here since it will be a little bit more visible, and I find the thicker, shinier floss looks a little bit nicer than thread. Alright, so it is now the next morning, and I didn't update you guys last night because I was actually sewing pretty much until I decided to go to bed. So I ended up getting the piping stitched down so the ribbon is no longer visible from underneath since the piping can't flare up. And I also whip stitched the underside of the binding down, so this is all nice and secure. Once I finished that, I marked the placement for the hooks and bars, or hooks and eyes rather, and I got all of those sewn on as well, except for the bottom two. I ran out of eyes in the size 2, and I think I might do an overlapping closure with bars at the waistline, so I wasn't planning on bringing them down that low anyway. So far this is going pretty well, and now it's at a point where I can more easily do fittings. So I can get started on the sleeves, which is the part I'm probably most nervous about. Sleeves and I just don't have a good relationship. They usually end up going wrong and being very frustrating and require a lot of mock-ups and still don't turn out the way I want them to. I think for the sleeves, I'm gonna have to get the photo of the accident garment up and reference that. I might put this on my dress form and kind of drape the sleeve placement so I can get an idea of the length, and then do an actual fitting on myself and transfer that to paper and do a proper mock-up and kind of go from the shoulder down in terms of drafting. But I don't have a super solid idea yet, so it's just gonna kind of come together throughout the day, and hopefully by the end of it we will have sleeves and maybe a skirt if I'm super ambitious and speedy when it comes to sewing. It is currently 11:35 a.m. I've been doing some editing this morning. As I'm sure you can hear outside, there are actually people over who are cutting down some of our trees that have died and are at risk of falling on the house. So I was taking care of my dog this morning since she gets really panicky around the noise. So I've been coddling her this morning and doing some editing when I can. I've also been coddling myself. I was taking this month's mailable rewards out to the mailbox, and on the way back inside, I face planted and scraped up my hand, and I also scraped up my ankle pretty badly. This entire area is really raw, and yeah, it's clearly kind of bled through that pad, which is really impressive because it's a thick pad of gauze. But yeah, that happened this morning, and it really hurts. It kind of feels like thousands of pins digging into that part of my body, and it's really difficult to ignore, but I don't think it's gonna go away, so I'm just gonna try and deal with that today and continue to get stuff done. I'm kind of like getting flashbacks to kindergarten and falling on the playground, scraping up my knees, but our driveway is worse than sidewalk or anything like that because it hasn't been sealed in like 15 years, so it's effectively all these tiny jagged rocks that are supported by a thin layer of concrete. So yeah, wouldn't recommend falling on that. It really hurts. I'm kind of leaning towards doing the sleeves like this dress, which is probably from a similar period, maybe slightly later, and it's got these really cool pleats across the sleeve, and then I'm thinking that instead of doing those tagging stitches, I could do little bands like you see on the sleeves of this piece. I'm going to keep the shape more streamlined like you see here, but I do want to implement the gathers they have right there, and I don't think it's going to show, which is really annoying. It's basically 2 lines, or 3 lines rather, of shearing, which cinch the sleeve down and the volume down, and then there's a cuff, and I think that's a really cute little detail, so I'm going to try and implement that on the dress that I'm making. You know what, the more I think about it, the more I want to gather down the tops too. I just feel like doing the gather detail up there is so much more interesting than having it be fitted to here. Maybe I'll draft the fit to here and see what I think of it, and then I can move on from there. But I'm not like totally sold on this design. So it's a little bit later now, and I think I figured out the sleeve pattern. I decided I'm going to do the fitted top portion of the sleeve as seen on the garment that I'm using as inspiration and reference for this piece. I like the idea of doing the gathered variant, but given my recent kind of hand injury, I'm not too keen on doing the hand sewing, and I'm not sure if I'm going to have enough fabric to do it. And I also think it's going to add bulk to the shoulder, which will make it fit more tightly across the arm thigh. And the arm thigh is pretty snug on me as is. So I don't feel like it's the best project to implement that technique on, even though I do really like how it looks. I also found out that doing the ruching at the back of the sleeve didn't look particularly good. To get that to work, I had to make the sleeves a lot wider than what works for the proportions of this specific set of sleeves. So what I've ended up with is something kind of boring, but pretty similar to the garment that I'm using as a reference for this one. So it is what it is. This is the top portion. It has a 1-inch seam allowance on the bottom and then 1/2-inch seam allowances everywhere else. It has a seam at the kind of side back, which is more accurate than underarm seams were during this period. Underarm seams weren't very popular until the latter half of the 1800s, and even then they weren't especially popular until you get into the early 1900s, because you actually have the least amount of control over the fit of a sleeve when you put the seam at the underarm, even though it is kind of nice that it's tucked away and less visible when the garment is worn. So anyway, for fitting purposes, I put it at kind of the side back, and then for the puffed portion that goes from the elbow to the wrist, it does actually close at the underarm. So those seams don't line up, which is a little bit annoying, but that's what works best for the closure method at the cuff. So I've got these two pieces that need to be cut out twice, and then I also have to cut out the cuffs, which are 7 inches by 2.25 inches, and the bands to go across the sleeves, which are 14 inches by 2.5 inches. And I'm also going to have to cut out some additional piping because this is all of the piping that I have left, and it has to go around both those bands as well as the cuff. As far as drafting this goes, I tried to drape the upper portion and it did not work, so I roughly drew something out based on the measurements of the arm side, and it was actually pretty bang on. I did have to make a few alterations and then a few alterations after fitting my first mock-up, but I did end up with this pretty quickly. It was actually the puffed portion that gave me more trouble, which is kind of interesting because I think of this being the easy part, but I drafted it to be about 4 inches too long, and I also drafted it to be way too wide. So it just had a bunch of volume and didn't look right at all. And it actually took me several variations of making it smaller and smaller until I had something that I was happy with. So this is what I'm working with now, and I'm going to get it cut out and sewn together. I'm not really looking forward to cutting this out. I'm sorry I've complained so much in this video, but I've got like this mark on my hand from this morning, and whenever I use scissors, it bangs against that mark and it's so uncomfortable. But I'm determined to progress on this today, which means I have to go ahead and get this cut out and hopefully get them assembled and sewn on today as well. So I shall report back to you guys once I've got all of the piping done and everything cut out, and then we can move forward. So I'm listening to this album and it's super good. It's a little different from what I would normally listen to, but I really, really like it. I would definitely recommend it if you're looking for something new. And that is all I have to say for now because I really want to turn that fan on because it's very warm in here. Even Gwen isn't bundled up underneath her covers because it's so hot in here. Progress has been made. So this is the top portion of the sleeve, this is the bottom portion of the sleeve, these are the bands for the top portion of the sleeve, and these are the cuffs. I'm also going to have to cut out the cuff lining at some point, but I can worry about that later. I also went ahead and made more piping, so now I can go ahead and pipe the edges of the bands, and then they will be all ready to be sewn on later today. So that's where I'm at now, and now I just have a whole bunch of hand gathering to do before it starts to come together. Welcome to my messy desk. So I have a little bit of an update for you guys. I went ahead and gathered the top edge of the bottom portion of the sleeve down, and that went really well. But when I was doing this, I realized that I couldn't sew these together because this belongs at the kind of side back, whereas this belongs at the center back seam. So this should actually be skewed like this to sit properly, and obviously I can't sew it on like that and then do up the side seam. So the side seams of these have to be done independently, and then they need to be sewn together by hand later on, which is kind of annoying but not a huge deal breaker. It just means I had to change the method of assembly a little bit differently. So instead I'm focusing on these as a separate piece and these as a separate piece, and they're going to get connected by hand later on. So for these guys, I went ahead and gathered the top edge down, and then I also gathered the bottom edge down. But I realized that there was going to be a lot of gathering and volume at this point, so I actually stitched a large dart into the sleeve to get rid of some of the volume at the bottom edge. And I'm thinking I'm going to do that for the skirt as well, because I want the gathers to be very defined and pretty, but I don't want that much excess bulk in the waistline of the bodice. So I might add a couple darts to the top of each panel and just assume that the stitching for them and the seam lines will kind of get lost in the print and the gathering. So that will be an interesting new thing that I've never really done before. I've made skirts that are gored before, but never a skirt that is supposed to look rectangular that has darts in the top. So we'll see how that goes. I also ended up having to remake the cuffs, which was really annoying because I had the perfect amount of piping for the cuffs and all of the bands, and then I realized I needed to redo the cuffs because I made them 7 inches when they actually needed to be 8.5 inches. I kind of forgot about fabric ease and how the material I was using for my mock-up was a lot less stiff than the material I'm using for the final thing, so I needed an additional 1/2 inch of ease, and I also needed 1 inch of seam allowances, which I hadn't really included. So I tried adding this little tab onto the end that doesn't have the piping to fix it, but it was still too small. So I had to make more piping, make new cuffs, and here we are. The next step for this is going to be doing up the side seam, finishing that nicely, and probably also finishing the top edge nicely, and then turning this portion of the edge inward by 1/4 inch twice, and stitching on the closures as well as the lining for the cuff. So that is going to be tonight's excitement. And then I also have these pieces which make up the top portion of the sleeves. So for these, I turned the bottom edge inward. One band is going to be sewn on to cover that, and then the other band is going to be placed about 1.5 inches away, just like that. So I'm going to get these pinned on, and then I can whip stitch them on by hand, probably while I'm watching TV. And I'm also going to prep these for the lining and turning the edges inward, so I can do that in front of the TV as well. Then hopefully later tonight I can get these all assembled and stitched onto the bodice. So that's where I am, and I'm pretty happy with how this is coming along, even though I did run into a few roadblocks with the cuff and overall assembly method, just because I didn't consider this process as deeply as I probably should have. More progress! So I got the bands sewn onto the sleeves, and then I sewed the sleeves into a tube. I just did up the back seam, and I decided not to finish this seam because I don't want to add any additional bulk to this since it is quite fitted to the upper portion. However, I have turned the seam allowance inward for the lower portion of the sleeve and whip stitched it down to keep it nice and secure. And this finishing work extends into the cuffs and neatly finishes that edge. Speaking of the cuffs, I did get the lining sewn into these, so that looks all nice and pretty. And now I'm ready to sew these pieces together. And hopefully once I do that, they will fit and I can go ahead and get them sewn onto the bodice. So it's the next day and I've made a lot of progress on the bodice. I got the sleeves sewn on and I will show you it tomorrow because it's almost done. But tonight I've just been working on the skirt. So I got all of the panels cut out and then I sewed 3 darts into the top of the panels. So that makes them 18 inches more narrow at the top edge. So there are 3 darts and they each pull in 6 inches of material. So now I have a lot less at the waistline to gather down, so it's not going to be as bulky at the waistline and create a little bump or anything that looks unfortunate. And I've also just pinned the hem, so I turned the hem inward by 1/2 inch and then inward by 2 inches, and there's a 1 inch allowance at the top. However, when doing this, I did run out of fabric, so I had to add a cotton strip just to make the hem wider, so I can maintain that hem allowance, but I don't have to use as much material to accomplish it. And I also had to add a band to the top of that panel too, and now I can't find it. Here it is. So you can maybe see the seam there. I just used a 1/4 inch allowance and I actually didn't finish the edges of it, which is bad of me, so don't tell anyone, but that makes it wider as well. So that's where I am now, and I'm going to try and get the hem sewn tonight and then get the top gathered down. I haven't been very productive today, to be honest. I just haven't been feeling that great. My throat's kind of sore. I've been really tired. I think it's allergy-related problems. And I also really screwed up my foot. I know I was complaining about it the other day, but it's more than just a flesh wound. It's really difficult to walk and climb upstairs. So I haven't been as productive as I probably should be, but hopefully I can get this project finished up tonight or tomorrow. I feel like I've been saying that for several days, but now I have confidence that that's actually going to happen since the sleeves are done and the bodice appears to fit. So that's where I'm at, and I will talk to you guys tomorrow. So I think I last left off with the skirt assembled and I was in the process of hemming it. So the hem has now been completed. I stitched it all with a cross stitch. And I did this in front of the TV and it was really relaxing and nice to do. Then I went ahead and gathered the top edge of the skirt down to about 29 or 28 inches. And I sewed it on using whip stitches by hand. So the stitching is across here. And there was a 1 inch allowance. So the gathering was done by hand 1 inch away from the top edge of the skirt. I also did little finishing details like adding the hooks and loops to the cuffs, which desperately need to be done. So there are 2 size 1 hooks placed on either cuff. I also added the final hooks to the back of the bodice, which couldn't be added until the skirt was sewn on. So the back of the bodice closes mostly with size 2 hooks and eyes, but then it closes at the waist with 2 hooks and bars. And the bars are secured to a little placket which extends past the center back line. And the reason for this is so the opening of the skirt can overlap slightly and the seam point in the opening won't be as visible when the dress is worn. So I used one of my failed cuff attempts piece to create this little extension, which extends out by an inch or so, and those are where the bars are placed, and then the hooks just slot nicely on top of those. And the reason I couldn't do this earlier is because the hooks are actually sewn on top of the seam allowance for the skirt. So I didn't end up finishing the top edge of the skirt. I didn't feel like it was necessary, and it wasn't commonly done in the 1830s or in any era, really. Sometimes you would see it done, but when you leave this top edge open, it makes it a lot easier to remove the skirt and adjust it for future wearers over time. So I did trim the top edge so it wasn't fraying as profusely, and I also whip stitched it to the lining so it shouldn't fray too much, but it is not finished the way you would finish a monard garment. But that is the interior, and that is the exterior. Wow, that is not a flattering photo of it. So yeah, I'm really pretty pleased with how this turned out. There are definitely things that could have been done better. This was a very different type of bodice construction for me. I've never done anything quite like this before, but I did enjoy the process and I did enjoy working on it a lot. As I said in my last video about the red dress, historical costumes are definitely where my heart is, so it's nice to get back to those, to take a couple days to just focus on them and focus on creating something that resembles something from the past. I've really enjoyed it, and I'm hoping to make a lot more projects like this, as well as some more elaborate historical projects as the year continues on. I know I haven't done very many of them this year, and we're already halfway through the year, but hopefully I can pick it up because, as I said, I really enjoyed this project and I would really like to make more things like this. Now, before ending this video, I think I should work a little bit on a headpiece to go with this. I'm not sure how much of that process I'm going to film. Today is actually Father's Day, so I'd really like to spend some time with my dad. I will try and do the drafting and show you some of the materials that I pick for it while I am still up here and have access to my camera. So my idea for the bonnet involves these materials, and I'd quite like it to look something like that. So if not even more simple, there are some that are basically pieces of material that are draped over the head without a whole lot of shaping, and I really like those as well. But I'm leaning towards something like this. I feel like that will flatter me and it won't take away from the overall design of the dress, and it should also be pretty easy to make. So these are the materials I have for it. I have this really pretty vintage, as in probably over 100 years old, lace material, and it's a very lightweight cotton. Then it has this beautiful embroidered design inside of it. So I have this, which I could use for this little front section, and then I also have this lace, which is vintage as well, which has the same kind of grayish coloring to it. So I'd really like to incorporate this somehow. And then I also have this mesh, which I got in the garment district, which I thought I could use for this back portion. And I also have this cotton gauze, which is the same kind of grayish ivory coloring. So this isn't as accurate of material, but it does match the coloring well. So I could use this if I need something sturdier in a matching tone. And you can iron and steam this material so it's completely flat. So if I do end up using it, I will definitely use it in that way. So my plan for making this is to measure my head and figure out how big this front section needs to be, and then kind of build backwards from there and see if I can come up with a mock-up that looks good, and then move on to making the real thing from there. And this will be kind of interesting. Usually when I'm making hat or headpiece mock-ups, I make them out of cardboard or paper or some sort of thick material, since that best represents the material I will be using for the final thing. But with this, it's definitely going to be made out of fabric, so I can make the mock-up for it out of fabric. So yeah, I've never done a cap or a soft bonnet before, so this will be a bit of an adventure. And I am planning on making the final thing mostly by hand, so you're not going to see a whole lot of the sewing process since I'll mostly be doing it downstairs, but I can try and document the drafting process a little bit since it might interest some of you. I kind of feel like this was too easy and this isn't going to work, but I basically just cut out a strip of cotton, which was the same width as one block of this trim plus 1 inch, which is the width of this trim. So the piece that I cut out of cotton was this wide, which is over here, and then I draped that over the kind of midsection of my scalp, and I marked where it hit just below my ears, and then I cut it at that point. So this is the part that will make up this section, and then I just cut out a wider rectangle and I cut that to be the same width, and then I tapered this edge, or rounded this edge rather. Now I'm going to try gathering this edge down to about 2 inches, so really densely gathered, but since in the final garment it will be made out of that dotty mesh, it's a very thin material, so it can be handled being gathered down that densely without being especially bulky. And I think that might give me the look that I'm going for, which just feels wrong because it's very easy, and I'm not used to things being that easy, but hopefully this is going to work, because that would make this whole day a lot easier for me. So that was shockingly effective. I just sewed them together with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance and I gathered the bottom edge down. Once I did the try on for it, I realized that it poked out and kind of puffed out over the front edge in a way that I didn't really like. And the only thing I had to do to fix that was just round this edge even more. It's probably not going to show up since the camera's black, since the fabric is black, but you might be able to see a ridge here, and that is what I pinned in from the interior. So I'm just going to round this edge off when I make the pattern, and then I should be able to assemble a cap really quickly and really easily and end up with something that looks really pretty. So I'm super excited about this. I think I'm also going to trim it with ruffles made out of this lace just by gathering it down. Though this lace is beautiful, it isn't in the best condition. It has a lot of little stains on it. So I think using it for ruffles where it's going to be kind of hidden is a good way of using it and kind of respecting it by pairing it with other materials from a similar period. So that's my plan for that. I will be sad to see it go, but yeah, I think it's a good use for this lace, so I'm going to use it for that. But right now I'm just going to remove all of the gathering and seams and everything and transfer this to paper. I will definitely put this pattern up either on Patreon or on my blog if you're interested, so I'll leave a link to that down below because it should be pretty easy for me to scan and upload, and it should definitely be easy for you guys to make if you're interested in having something similar. I transferred everything to paper, and this is the band that goes at the front, and this is the poofy portion, kind of, the cap portion, I guess, that goes at the back. So I've already cut this portion out of the mesh material, and I'm going to turn this bottom edge inward by 1/4 inch twice to create a very tiny channel for ribbon or twine. I'm probably going to use this twine, actually, which is what's going to gather that edge down and cause it to fit the head. And since it will be gathered, it will be adjustable, which is really nice. I also cut out the band, so this is going to be the front section, and then this is going to attach with tiny whip stitches right behind it, and I'm going to fold all of the cotton inward so you don't see that, you just see the borders of the lace. Then this edge will eventually be sewn to this edge, so it should come together pretty quickly and easily. Well, probably not quickly because a lot of this is going to be done by hand, so it'll take a little bit of time, but I think it's going to come together within a couple hours, which is really nice. I love hand sewing projects like that. Usually whenever I take on a hand sewing heavy project, it takes like days and many hours, and it can get quite frustrating even though I really enjoy hand sewing, and I don't think this is going to be one of those projects, which is great. In addition to doing all of that, I'm also going to gather all of this lace down so it can eventually border this edge as well as the front of the band. So I still have to iron this, but this is the band that will go around the front. I just sewed the lace on using tiny whip stitches from the other side of the material. That is how you can stitch things together if you want to do it without having any seam allowance, and the edges are already nicely finished like they are with lace. I also sewed the channel into the bottom edge of this mesh. It isn't perfectly even just because this fabric is so slippery and malleable, but I think it's pretty good. So after giving this a little iron, I'm going to stitch this edge onto this edge of the band, and then I can gather down the bottom edge and start gathering the ruffles down. So it's a little while later now, and I did a whole bunch of hand sewing, and the cap is finished. So I realize this looks very different than the last time you saw it, but I actually didn't do that much. It's a very simple thing to create. So last you saw it, I had this band and I had this piece separate. So I ended up threading some twine through the channel that I sewed at the bottom of the mesh piece, and then I tied that at the back to gather it down so it fits better over the nape of my neck. Then I stitched the mesh to the lace using whip stitches from the interior. So the mesh actually extends a 1/2 inch over into the lace, but the lace obviously doesn't have a seam allowance since it is lace, but you can kind of see the stitches there. Then I folded these edges inward twice to neatly finish it off. And the final step was gathering the lace down and then whip stitching it onto the edge using very teeny tiny stitches that you might not even be able to see. Do you see them? So that's where I connected the lace, and I also gathered the lace down with whip stitches. And I actually have a pretty decent amount of lace left over. I ended up doubling the perimeter of the brim, and that was the length I cut the lace to be, and then I gathered it down to 1/2 its original length. So I have lots of lace left over, which is nice, and I also have a beautiful cap. I've tried it on, I do like how it looks, but I haven't tried it on with styled hair, so I think it's going to look different, and hopefully better different, once my hair is styled appropriately for this cap. But overall, I'm really happy with how quickly this came together and how enjoyable it was to make, and I'm going to wear it a lot, I think, because it should go with a pretty wide variety of projects. And I'm also looking forward to making more caps in the future. I've always shied away from them because I feel like bonnets and hats are more fun, but I enjoyed the process of this. It'd be nice to make one from the 1860s, or perhaps one from the earlier 1700s and 1600s, since I have a few more casual projects planned for those periods. So yeah, I'm happy with this, and I'm also happy with the dress that I made. It is currently sitting in a heap on my sewing machine, as you can see here. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to include worn photos of it in this video. Again, I know everyone complains about that, and I understand your complaints, but I have to get these videos edited and uploaded several weeks in advance, so people on Patreon can get early access, and also so the videos can go through a vetting process before I publish them to the world. However, I promise there will be a blog post with more information about this project that also includes photos of it worn. So if you would really like to see those, then follow the link in the description box, and I promise you, you will find some there. And on that note, I'm going to end this video. If you enjoyed it, then giving it a like and a comment really helps me out. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, then you can definitely subscribe. If you'd like to get early access to my videos as well as additional exclusive content, then definitely check out my Patreon. I still have to make a headpiece to go with the red dress that you saw in my previous video, and the whole process of making the bonnet and drafting the bonnet for that is going to be in a Patreon exclusive vlog. So that is a place where you can see additional content if that interests you. And I also post somewhat regularly on my Instagram account, so you might want to check that out. And I'm going to try and post more regularly on my blog. So if any of that interests you, it's all going to be linked in the description box down below. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will talk to all of you very soon.